are strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea.
All right, so Leviticus 25 makes or it is a significant transition in this book. Like I said a moment ago, Leviticus 16 is the central chapter. It functionally is about atonement, and atonement is a central theme to the entire gospel. And so, as we've talked about before, the overall purpose of this book is to explain to the children of God how it is that they who are not pure can have a relationship with God who is pure. And if you get to the end of the book of Exodus and the opening of the book of Leviticus, there is that situation where the temple has been, or the tabernacle has been finished. God's presence has arrived at the tabernacle. The people are afraid to go to the tabernacle because of his presence. Just exactly like Adam and Eve were afraid and hid themselves from the presence of God in the garden after they sinned, that's what was going on here. And so the question is, how do you bridge that gap, and how do you make it possible for the people of God to actually be in fellowship with God and to not be afraid to approach God? And this book is explaining. And it goes through and catalogs all of the sacrifices that are involved and all of these things that are involved for them to be able to approach God and to have fellowship with God. And then has chapter 16, which talks about the atonement. And in their case, there was an annual sacrifice in which their sins were sacrificed for with one goat, and then another goat, the scapegoat, was sent out into the wilderness to carry their sins away. Um, an extremely important theme to the Bible. This one is fundamentally just as important about redemption. You would call this the chapter on redemption. Now, the theme of redemption appears throughout this book, but this chapter is focused on it a lot more. It shows how the Lord restores all that belongs to him. And so the preceding chapters, they've emphasized holiness and worship. They've talked about the priesthood. They've talked about sacrifices. They defined the holy things and the appointed times, which we just got through a few weeks ago. And then the covenant community was defined in chapter 23, 24. And this chapter is saying, okay, all of those same principles applies to the land. The inheritance that the Lord has promised to give them. That is what that's why we refer to it as the promised land. What is the analog? That's the word I'll use, I guess. What's the analog for the land of Canaan in the gospel setting, in the spiritual setting? We know, for instance, the atonement sacrifice. What's the analog for that? The substance of that. Okay, the death of Christ on the cross. The Passover lamb, which predated the law, but the Passover lamb. What's the spiritual significance of that? Christ. Okay, so each one of these things is a shadow of something that he's trying to teach about that doesn't have a physical manifestation that can be seen and measured and touched and all that kind of stuff. What is the equivalent of the promised land for the Christian? Heaven. That's what we've been promised, is a dwelling in heaven with God. Remember, they left Egypt, their land of bondage, to go out into the wilderness and dwell with God, particularly to go out and worship God, is specifically what Moses was told to tell Pharaoh. As they traveled across that land, there is the River Jordan, and then there's the Promised Land on the other side. And you can't get to the Promised Land until you do what? Cross Jordan, which, by the way, we have a poetic connection between crossing Jordan and death. That's not necessarily a strictly biblical thing, but it is poetic language we use, especially in a lot of old hymns. So we pass through death and enter into our promise. The New Testament also calls that for us our Sabbath rest. And so as he talks about the Sabbath rest in the book of Hebrews, for instance, he gets to the point and he says, therefore remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That's not something that happens in life. That's something that happens when this life. That's when we rest from our labor. It is by no accident that this chapter opens up with a discussion about a Sabbath for the land. So we have to start kind of thinking in terms of, okay, does this have a shadow substance relationship with something? And if so, what is it? As we read and study and discuss these things. And so how pure is heaven? How holy is heaven? How much sin is in heaven? Let me ask that question. None. How much darkness is in heaven? Light and darkness, same thing as truth and error, same thing as sin and righteousness. There is no night there. Why? Well, the sun is there, is the way it's presented in Revelation. The presence of God itself, who is the light, is there. Okay, so if heaven is pure and holy, he's telling them your land needs to be pure and holy. And their behavior is what can defile the land. And that's a problem. So he's teaching them that they need to be holy so that they are fit to dwell in this land, in this inheritance that he has given them. Israel's reminded that neither the land nor the people ultimately belong to themselves. And we're going to see that through some of these laws that are in the latter part of this book. They didn't have land ownership the way that we think of land ownership. How did they get the land that they had? Through the prescription of God. God said, okay, this portion of the land belongs to this tribe, and it's to be divided in this way. And in fact, there were cities throughout Israel that belonged to who? The Levites. What they all belonged, and that's where I'm going with this, is ultimately all of the land belongs to God. And they simply are what? They're the tenants or the stewards of the land. If you understand feudal English law, it's a whole lot easier to understand this arrangement. Because ultimately, the entire nation of England belonged to who? The king. And then the king divided up the sections of the land and gave it to the Lord. And the Lord ruled in that territory. And the Lord divided it up and gave it out to tenant farmers. And so if the king decides, you know what, we don't need as much wheat as we got, we need some barley, he would just send messengers to the Lord and say, we need barley. And they would instruct the tenant farmers to do what? You plant barley. It wasn't like the farmer got to go, okay, I want to plant this because I can make more money. It was all about what was in the best interest of the kingdom because everything belonged to the king. And your use of it was a privilege. That's also where our doctrine of eminent domain comes from. Our laws in the United States derive directly from common law in England. And eminent domain is the law that allows the government to say this land is more useful as a highway than it is as your house. And so you don't get to live there anymore because we're going to build a highway here. Now, in America, we're at least nice enough to financially compensate people when they lose land like that. But when there was a king, that's not the way it worked. If the king decided somebody else could use that land more effectively than you, you just got booted off of it and somebody else was given your land and your house and everything else. And so that's how you need to think of this. That's how they were being taught to think of themselves even. Not just the property that they came to possess, but their own lives. Why? Where had they got this life from? Fundamentally from God, in terms of just their genesis, but even beyond that, how they became free and able to own land and produce and acquire wealth. Well, because of God's blessing and God's removing them from bondage. In the New Testament, that same principle is echoed to us in a spiritual sense. For you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify yourselves. Is that what the Bible says? And therefore, glorify God in your body. You don't belong to yourself. And that is what we start getting taught here when we look through these, some people would call them rules, some people would call them laws, some people might call them commandments, but it's the regulations about how they should live. The Lord redeemed them from Egypt. He gave them their inheritance. He therefore remains and retains the right to govern and control all of it. And you've got this theme that emerges throughout this chapter. What the Lord has redeemed belongs to the Lord. And he provides a way for restoration whenever loss has occurred. And that's an important theme because there's some land rules throughout here that we're going to look at. All of that is about this, okay? It belongs to God. God gave it to you. If you're separated from it, through this process that I give you, you can be reunited with it. So we make spiritual application of that concept. We've been promised salvation. We've been promised an inheritance in heaven. If at some point we get separated from that, God has given us a process by which we can be rejoined with our inheritance. You don't just automatically lose your inheritance the way that someone did before that. It's gone. Oh, well, can't do anything about it. Can't have it again. This, because it all belongs to God and not me, because it's based on Him and not me, that separation doesn't have to be permanent if he provides a way to bridge that gap. And so just keep those things in mind. So we start off with the Sabbath year. The Lord then spoke to Moses, and we've seen this in every single chapter I think that we have looked at. It begins this way: the Lord spoke. This book, more than any book in the Bible, makes very clear who the source of this information is. This is all from God. This wasn't Moses sitting down going, you know what? Let me call my advisors in and let's figure out the best way for us to get along and the best system that we can create so that we can prosper. How do we answer our economic needs? How do we answer this problem or that problem? Let's figure out a way for this government to work out. All of this came from God. The Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its crop. But during the seventh year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvests after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. And all of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food, yourself and your male and female slaves and your hired men and your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you, even your cattle and the animals that are in your land shall have all its crops to eat." Um, so this only applies once they enter the land that the Lord has promised them. That's the first thing that we want to take note of. This is not a general rule. This isn't something that we can go, hey man, things would be more productive if we would just not plant crops every 7 years and not do anything and not work. Um, that's not a general rule. This is a specific rule for them in those circumstances. Um, he says the land itself is to observe a Sabbath to the Lord. Now, can land observe anything? No, it's non-sentient. And so really, this is about the people recognizing God's rule and right over the land, that it's not theirs. How many commercial farmers in the United States do you think would go, you know, we're just not going to plant this year, every seventh year? Zero. Why not? Because the only way that you make money is if you harvest and sell. And how often do they want to make money? Every year. They don't want a year off with no income. This is not a natural thing for someone to decide. I'm not even sure it makes a whole lot of physiological sense. I do know that letting um, land lay fallow for a while can have a benefit. Don't know that it takes a year. I do know that when it's done, there's usually an off crop planted, just something different than what you normally plant. And then that's tilled under and supplies nutrients to the ground, and you start planting again. Um, but I'm not sure. I know that the trees in my neighborhood don't disappear every 7 years and then grow back. They grow on the land as long as they're there. And there's never a Sabbath rest. The forest, there's no Sabbath rest of the forest. This is certainly not a naturally occurring thing. There's no physiological reason that he's instructing these things. That means it's for teaching purposes. He's trying to get them to learn something. Anybody want to guess what he's trying to get them to learn? We're going to find out who read the whole chapter and who hasn't read the whole chapter. Anybody want to guess what he's trying to get them to learn? Okay, keep that question in mind, and we'll come back to it in just a minute. 6 years, you can sow your field, you can prune your vineyard, you can gather your crops. 7th year, Sabbath of solemn rest for the Lord. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. You don't even prune your vines. You just let them grow. During that year, you do not sow, you do not prune your vineyard, you reap the aftergrowth, and you gather grapes, but you don't maintain it. Whatever grows naturally becomes food for the owner, for his servant, for his hired man, for his foreign resident, for his cattle, and for the wild animals. Who is maintaining the fields and the vineyards at that point? God. And that begins to introduce what he is teaching them through this process. And by the way, what he's teaching us by extension. All of these thousands of years later, he's hoping that we've already picked up on it. The land is not merely productive soil. The land belongs to God. So it's going to participate in the Lord's Sabbath. The Sabbath has become so unimportant, hasn't it? He's introduced it on a couple of occasions. He actually gives a couple of different reasons for it in the scriptures. It's becoming more and more apparent that it's important. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, by the time we get to Hebrews, we find out why it's so important, because it represents our ultimate rest in heaven. It's the Lord's rest, and he doesn't need to rest. By the way, if you remember Genesis 1, that's what it says. He rested on the 7th day. Did God get tired? Did he not have the strength to continue on and work another day? The answer to all that is no. He was again doing something that he was going to use to instruct us. Israel is taught that fruitfulness ultimately depends upon trusting in God's provision, not their own. It comes up again. This presents itself as an illustration a lot. To the people who are regulars, I apologize. We got a couple of visitors. May not have thought about this. The movie Shenandoah. Jimmy Stewart. Love the movie. One of my favorite movies of all time. There's a great scene where he is praying at the beginning of the movie. And he says, he's offering thanks for his food. And he talks about the fact that they cleared the land and they busted the land. They removed the rocks and they planted it and they took care of it and they harvested it and they brought it in and they cooked it. But we think it's still the same anyway. What is the point of that very sarcastic prayer that he makes? Well, the point is, well, we're going to thank you, God, but we're actually responsible. We did everything. These folks are being taught a long time ago that it's not them that do anything, that it's God. By the way, for those of you that are not familiar with the movie, by the end of the movie, Jimmy Stewart completely changes and comes to realize that. But anyway, look with me real quick. I'm going to jump ahead to verses 18 through 21. And we're going to see, now this gets into the year of Jubilee discussion, but the principle is the same that's being discussed. Look at verse 18. You shall thus observe my statutes and keep my judgments so as to carry them out, that you may live securely on the land. Then the land will yield its produce so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. You notice it's the land that he says is going to yield its produce. They are not going to produce anything. The land is going to produce. But if you say, what are we going to eat on the 7th year if we do not sow or gather our crops? Now, see, there's the question. wait a minute, if we do the Sabbath thing and every 7 years we don't do anything, how are we going to eat that year? See, that's the question that any of us would ask. By the way, to show you how much human nature thinks that it depends upon itself and it working, anybody know when the last time that the majority of businesses in this country were closed on Sunday? I'm sorry? What was your guess? That's pretty good guess. The end of the 70s, I think, maybe into the early 80s, but sometime right around in there. What happened? They were called blue laws. Okay, every state had a blue law which said what? Businesses can't be open on Sunday. And the minute those laws fell by the wayside, what happened? Businesses opened all week. In fact, we got some businesses that not only open 7 days a week, but they're also open what? 24 hours a day. Because if you don't work, then you can't make money. If you don't make money, you can't survive. So we just got to work, 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 work. God is showing them that it is not by their hand that they prosper. It's His doing. Interestingly enough, when we plant a field and tend to it and water it and fertilize it and harvest it, how much of that have we caused to happen? There's a parable in Mark that addresses this. It says that you plant it and then it grows up and you know not how. And it puts on a flower and you know not how. And it produces fruit and you know not how. Or as James puts it, not James, I'm going to draw a blank on which book it's in. Anyway, I planted and Apollos, that's 1 Corinthians. I planted and Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. See, it's God that actually causes the plant to grow. It's God that actually causes the fruit to set. It's God. Even when I'm working, it's God. That's an important lesson. And it's part of what we're being taught in this chapter. Does it mean that we can not work at all? No. What did we get taught in, what is that, 1 Thessalonians? That if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. So it's not teaching us that we don't have to work at all. It's saying that when we work and do everything that we can, much of what we have is still provided to us beyond our ability. How many of us could build a corn plant if we wanted to? Tomato plant, grapevine, an apple tree. We can't do any of those things. We would have no apples except for the fact that the earth grows trees and they provide fruit. We can cultivate them and isolate certain characteristics about them and maybe even increase the production through certain methods, but the process itself is outside of our vineyard. And that has some spiritual application as well. So anyway, as he goes on, you say, what are we going to eat on the 7th year if we do not grow or gather our crops? Then I will order my blessing for you in the 6th year, that it will bring forth the crop for 3 years. When you are sowing the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when the crop comes in. This sounds a little bit like something else that happened in the book of Exodus and Numbers. Anybody remember what that was? Provision of manna. He provided for how many days? 6 days. And on the seventh day, they were told, you don't gather. And then he did something else even more important. At that point, he said, don't gather extra. On the sixth day, don't gather extra. And you'll still have enough until the first day. Here he says, understand that that 6-year crop is going to be so big, it's going to take care of year 6, it's going to take care of year 7, it's going to take care of year 8 while you're waiting for that crop to actually come in. I am going to provide for you. You're not dependent upon the crops, you're dependent upon me. And that's a difficult lesson to learn, but it's an important lesson to learn. Any questions or comments about that before we get into the year of Jubilee? Year of Jubilee is an interesting animal. I'm not even going to pretend that I have figured it all out. I think today I'll probably just introduce this because this turns into a 3-pronged discussion and is rather lengthy. But we'll introduce the idea of the year of Jubilee by reading together, and then we'll break it down and talk about it next time. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely the 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month of the Day of Atonement. You shall sound a horn all throughout your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow nor reap in its aftergrowth, nor gather from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend, or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years, you shall increase the price, and in proportion to the fewness of the years, you shall diminish its price, for it is the number of crops he is selling to you. That last sentence is an important sentence, and I'm going to go ahead and break here and make some comments. We're probably going to reread all that next week anyway. What's he mean by this? For it's the number of crops that you're selling. It starts off with if you sell your land to somebody, you got to take this 50-year thing into account. Because every 50 years, what happens? It goes back to the owner. And so if somebody buys your land and next year's Jubilee, guess how long they have possession of your land? A year. That's it. And so he says, listen, don't be unjust to folks. You're not selling the property. Who's the property belong to? It belongs to God, and then it belongs to them by extension because God gave it to them. Gave it to the tribes, gave it to the families within the tribes. It goes back to the family that God gave it to every Jubilee. And so if you sell it the year after Jubilee, you're selling 49 years use of the land. If you sell it the year before Jubilee, you're selling 1 year's use of the land. So he says, be just and adjust the price accordingly. Take into account when the next Jubilee is and don't charge, because they're paying for the crops. They're not paying for the property. It's basically land use. It's what we would call a land use lease. Why would they sell it? I'll tell you why they sell it. They get into a financial situation and they need money. They're basically getting an advance. So they lease the property to someone else to use for the next 10 years, because Jubilee's 10 years away. They basically get 10 years worth of crops money today, instead of having to get it year after year after year after year over that 10 years. But then at the end of the 10 years, they take possession of their land again. It is a way for them to raise capital. And so he says, look, you need to be just. You need to realize you're not selling them land. It's not perpetual. When I buy a piece of property, what's that mean? In fact, all of our land contracts actually say it. In perpetuity. You'll find that language in you own this in perpetuity, which means what? It's yours from here on out. Unless you do what? Unless you sell it. That was not what happened here. And we're going to find out there's a lot of things about the way they did business that was contingent on the fact that they ultimately needed to recognize God's ownership and not their own. That they were stewards and users of these blessings, not owners and controllers. All right, I appreciate your presence. For those that are visiting, I'm going to break for a couple of minutes, let all the kids come in, and then we'll have a brief couple of songs and a brief thing at the end.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.